Almost everybody I speak to in the defence sphere thinks we're effectively in a low-level war with the Russians, even as we speak, and that things could get a lot worse. And there does seem to be increasingly regularly a situation where Labour or its ministers or its hangers-on behave in a way that they would regard as absolutely deplorable were it done by anybody else on the political spectrum.
Hello and welcome to Coffee House. I'm James Seal and I'm joined today by Tim Shipman. Coming up, can the UK actually defend itself? Will the Prime Minister be able to survive past May? And what is going on with Morgan McSweeney's favourite think tank? Now, Tim, overnight there's been reports about the government potentially considering increasing defence spending up to 3%, which would be about sort of 17.3 billion extra a year. How credible are they likely that the government's going to be increasing that by 2029?
I think it's quite telling that people in the government have felt the need to start saying this. And, this is a report by James Landale at the BBC, who we all know has got good contacts and would not have written something this bold unless it had a degree of credible briefing behind it. You know, the Prime Minister pledged to get us on a pathway to 5% of defence spending, 3.5% on the sort of hard defence stuff and 1.5% of things that they could claim was defence spending. But even that was punted well into the next Parliament. And the significance here is that they'd be bringing forward the target to 2029, and that makes it in this Parliament, and that makes it a problem for Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, to find the money. I think what's interesting about it, James, is that we've heard a lot about John Healey in recent weeks. The Defence Secretary is, long been seen as a good, safe pair of hands and, a decent chap, but not someone who exerted great influence with Downing Street. I took a call this morning from someone saying, well, isn't it interesting that the second John Healey starts being mentioned as a potential Prime Minister, a stand-in sort of compromise character between those who want West Streeting and Angela Rayner, and suddenly it sounds like Downing Street are listening rather more to John Healey. The other point, of course, being that the Prime Minister's just been at the Munich Security Conference, and in times past, Britain has been one of the people chivying other people to spend their money around Europe. But it's a rather more difficult position to be in when others across Europe are bringing in conscription. The Poles are spending 5% already, and we are lagging behind. So it feels to me like all that's come together into a situation where they've felt that they need to start at least putting pressure on the Treasury to find some money.
And of course, the danger is, Tim, is that, yes, John Healey might be emboldened by this, but of course, when it comes to spending, he is greatly outgunned by the kind of social services departments. You look at the sort of health brief, the education brief, DWP, they'll all be demanding extra money as well. So fine, we could say, defence have got a sort of a licence to go and get a bit more cash. But actually, given the Labour Party's revealed preferences in recent months, presumably that money is going to go, if it exists, is going to go to sort of welfare rather than warfare.
Well, I mean, that is the danger. And it's interesting, we're obviously talking about something that the Starmer government is proposing. What would a Rayner government do, or a Streeting government? I think we probably know what a Healey government would do, but it still seems vanishingly unlikely to me that John Healey is going to be handed the premiership on a plate. So this is a debate the Labour Party is going to have. And there's quite a lot of interesting polling around over the last few days, some of which was done in conjunction with that Munich Security Conference, where effectively, people are not willing to see their taxes go up to pay for defence. People are not willing to see public services cut to pay for defence. And there seems to be a sort of fundamental lack of kind of awareness that we're in a kind of low-level war already with the Russians, and that the threats looming here, there and everywhere, particularly from them and the Chinese on a cyber battlefield, and that more money is going to be needed if we're going to preserve our kind of sovereign integrity as a country. And those are not debates, frankly, that the Labour Party really wants to seem to have at the moment.
Yes, and I mean, it's quite striking to me that whenever you get the defence ministers talking about having more guns and munitions, etc., they always do it as a sort of, well, it's a win-win. Actually, it boosts our domestic economy and it supports industries here. That's true to an extent. But actually, of course, we know that it's always been seen as a sort of almost like a sort of sinkhole by the Treasury, in that you have to actually spend this money. It doesn't really yield a return on investment in the same way that research and development often does. And actually, really, it's just actually a necessary thing we need to do. And frankly, we don't seem to be honest about the sort of trade-offs of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And also, I was very struck speaking to General Sir Nick Carter, the former Chief of the Defence Staff. I've done an interview with him, which we'll put out later in the week. And he was pointing out that the big programme that's cost sort of £5 billion that the army has going, this Ajax fighting vehicle, which is turning into a total disaster, troops getting in it and it's shaking them up and giving them illnesses and all the rest of it. That was put in South Wales deliberately to try and sort of stimulate investment and sort of defence industries down there, and also, bluntly, to bung some jobs to South Wales, which is slightly impoverished part of the country. But the point he was making is that actually most of our defence industry is sort of around the Midlands and slightly further north up into Lancashire. It's not round there at all. And, if you're looking to build a sort of synergistic defence industry.
At Philip Morris International, we're delivering a smoke-free future today. Our ambition is to replace cigarettes with better, smoke-free alternatives for legal-age consumers. And we're making significant progress. Learn more at pmi.com/progress.
And the Treasury talks a big game about this, tech jobs and all that kind of thing, and saying it's good for the country. And also there's obviously a strategic thing. The government was prepared to intervene to ensure that steel production remained in Britain, because that, partly for industry's sake, but also partly for the sake of defence as well. You need some kind of sovereign capability in steel. So all this stuff is linked together. But what the government hasn't done really, I don't think, is to come up with a story that kind of, hangs all this together, that's persuasive to the public. It's very clear from the polls that the public's not really persuaded. And while there might be a few inconveniences occasionally when the odd website goes down, their lives at the moment are not really touched by this. And I think almost everybody I speak to in the defence sphere thinks we're effectively in a low-level kind of war with the Russians, even as we speak, and that things could get a lot worse. And that sort of sense of urgency that those of us ancients who remember the Cold War, unlike you whippersnappers here, that sort of sense of peril is pretty absent at the moment, don't you think? I mean, your generation, you're a bit younger than me. There's quite, there's a sort of thing that people fundamentally don't think they want to fight for their country, or can't imagine the circumstance in which that would happen. I mean, do you find that from people of your own age group that you're talking to?
Certainly, I think that when it comes to modern warfare, there is that sense of it not being part of maybe older generations who came after kind of a post-mass mobilisation society. You think, obviously, national service ended in 1960s, but the long shadow of that war, having a heavily militarised society, having a sort of socially cohesive sense of community, something that leaders, even as late as sort of Jim Callaghan in the late 1970s, could appeal to, that kind of collective community spirit when he talked about the sacrifices necessary to get through political challenges. That was all part, I think, of that long shadow of the war. And I think that has largely dissipated from modern generations. Yes, people feel a sense of patriotism, I think, but it is much more atomised in a sort of internet age. And I do think that sense of sacrifice is one where the immediate response from people who are in their 20s and 30s is, well, hang on a sec, I've sacrificed plenty, mate. I've given up, sort of many of my savings in terms of paying for university. I had to give up years of my life in terms of the COVID pandemic. So I do think there is a sense now of transaction rather than any kind of great sense of sacrifice that maybe existed 50 years ago.
This is sort of reverse Kennedyism, really. It's not so much what can I do for my country, it's what can my country do for me. These people owe me a bit of a favour. I think you and I have spoken about this before as well, but it's the same at the top of politics to a degree. There were, up until the sort of well into the 80s, there were people who'd fought in the war who were in politics and had a background in national service or whatever. That's sort of wholly absent. Defence has become a much more kind of niche pursuit and interest, it seems to me, whereas it was something that pretty well everybody had a view on when I was first looking at politics in my sort of, 7, 8, 10 years old in the early to mid 80s. There were war films on the telly bluntly every weekend. And I often think that mistake that Rishi Sunak made during the general election, where he kind of pulled out of the D-Day celebrations a little bit early and it ended up costing him a huge amount politically. I think Rishi Sunak grew up staring at spreadsheets, not watching Where Eagles Dare like I did. And he's only sort of 7 or 8 years younger than I am, and he's a bit older than you are. But I think that lack of kind of collective experience of the Cold War and memory of the Second World War, which was a big sort of foundational thing for a whole generation of people in politics, I think that's gone completely. And I think winning these arguments and making these a persuasive case that, defence spending ought to be a core part of what the government does is a much harder sell now than it used to be.
Certainly, and I also think the spirit of bipartisanship in which that was entered into maybe 30 or 40 years ago has gone, in the sense that most MPs don't have experience in the military, and it's also, I think, potentially, particularly given the sort of how the Labour Party got hollowed out in recent years, something that isn't so much an experience on within many of their ranks, although albeit you've got very important high-profile cases like Al Khan's, who was obviously served himself. You mentioned there, Tim, Where Eagles Dare, which is a daring story about impossible odds pulling off a rescue mission. And this leads on nicely to our second story, which is the Prime Minister's ongoing survival against all the foes amassed against him on his own side and those opposite him. I mean, Keir Starmer's made it to recess. I think at one point people were briefing he wanted to make it to Munich. How is his survival chances going?
Well, I mean, he made it to Munich, and when he was in Munich, he said, well, I'm much stronger at the end of the week than I was at the beginning of it. I mean, I think it's interesting if we dissect that. I think that is true in the short term. I think he has bought himself some time. The fact that when Anas Sarwar, the leader of Labour in Scotland, said, Prime Minister, you should resign, and 1, 2 or half a dozen members of the cabinet did not then jump up in the air and say, I agree with you, Anas, which privately they do, or did at least. I think, we've seen this in the past. I mean, I know the Tories were sort of massive bloodletting for 5 years, but even they pulled back from the brink several times during that. Theresa May, I think most people would now tell you should have been got rid of after the 2017 general election. It was 2 whole years before she was dispensed with. So we should perhaps readjust our sort of timescales here. But so I think in the short term, Starmer is probably safer, but there's still the unexploded bomb of a lot of Mandelson messages. There's still a by-election, which is at best touch and go for the Labour Party. There's still the May elections, which look very bad. And ultimately, I mean, we talked about this last week. I think, the left of the Labour Party might think, well, if we can push him around and get him to do our thing, then maybe that's okay. But you do get to the point where you think if you're going to do sort of soft left, red in tooth and claw, you might as well have Angela Rayner doing it, who can do it with a bit more gusto than Keir Starmer. So it seems to me he's safer in the short term, but in the medium to long term, things are still pretty dicey for the Prime Minister. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that it's so striking is that listening and reading Lee Kane, who's on a load of focus groups for Charlesby today, saying the Prime Minister is hated in parts of the country, and weak is the word that comes up in focus groups. I do think that a lot of this kind of poison can be attached to him, which potentially will be something that does for him around the time of May. I think it's probably 50-50 if he sort of gets through that period or not. But I think that when it comes to survival, it's very much like learning from the lessons of the past. And I think that the Number 10 operation were probably privately quite surprised at how well they did last Monday afternoon when they were able to sort of turn it around. No one came out.
Some of the briefings were great. There was a definite sense of like, we did quite well here. We hit the phones and everybody kind of agreed with us. And that, there's sort of inherent in what they're saying is that they weren't necessarily expecting it to be that smooth.
Well, I think that shows how difficult it is to get rid of a Prime Minister, even now, in pursuit of a healthy working majority when there's no clear successor, and particularly the Labour Party, where, it's very much, we talk about the good chap theory all the time, Tim, particularly with relation to the Tories, but really the good chap theory ought to belong to Labour, because, the last time they tried to get rid of a leader, it was Jeremy Corbyn, and said, come on, Jeremy, do the decent thing, had the so-called chicken coup of 2016, everyone resigned, and he refused to go. And it's sort of Starmer, I won't compare Starmer to Mrs Thatcher many times on this podcast, but it does remind me slightly of the attitude, which is that it was once said of her that if she was asked to resign and handed a whiskey and a revolver, she would drink the whiskey and shoot the messenger. And I think that's basically what Starmer's sort of trying to do, all this bullishness around briefings about how angry he is, how passionate he is. And so I think it's therefore unsurprising that he's still there, sort of having made another foreign trip this weekend. And then today's announcement on online safety, I think, is quite telling, which is that it's something that some of his backbenchers want. It's something that's not particularly divisive across the party. It's not a great left-right split on having things such as consultations for banning social media for kids. And I think it's something that's kind of the classic easy recess stories. And for me, it reminds me sort of 10 years on from all those stories around plastic bags being banned by the Theresa May government. It is, in one sense, a sensible thing to do. It is also a tacit reflection of the weakness of the Prime Minister at the current time.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That old whiskey and revolver quote, I'm very fond of that, because I remember when Boris Johnson was having some of his problems, that someone sort of effectively gave me that quote, if they come in here and try and tear him out, he'll shoot them back. And it was one of those rare occasions where Boris Johnson read the newspapers and enjoyed what he read in it. And I got a message from him, in fact, he was saying, "Too bloody right, I'll shoot the buggers if they try and come anywhere near me." So just occasionally you get this sort of positive feedback from politicians who mostly don't like the explosive quotes that find their way into a copy. But that was one occasion where Boris was minded to reach out to tell me how much he was looking forward to shooting people in the head if they attempted. I think he was gone about a month later, so it was, the joke was on him in the end. But yeah.
Well, Tim, that brings us nicely on to the third story, which is someone who did not enjoy probably reading about their antics in the Sunday Times, or alleged antics, which is, of course, the ongoing reports about what Labour Together did when allegedly it was involved in sort of paying a large sum of money to a public affairs firm to look into a couple of journalists who were doing some digging. And I think as an ex-Sunday Times man yourself, you can talk us through it.
It's one of those where I'm probably quite relieved I'm not at the Sunday Times anymore. It's a real kind of quite a tense issue over there. So Gabriel Pogrund, who I should stress is confesses a friend of mine and worked with me on my first couple of books, one of the great reporters of Fleet Street these days, who, breaks a lot of big stories. And unlike us sort of lobby chaps who spend our day, worrying about the day to day, Gabriel goes off and does these big investigations. He gets past quite a lot of data and insider stuff. And, he spends a lot of time talking to the lawyers and making sure that he can do absolutely copper bottom stories. And he's caused a huge amount of irritation to people in politics, in the royal family, in business. And really, his agenda as a journalist is getting great stories and, frankly, uncovering wrongdoing and making wrong-uns pay for their misbehaviour. And so he did some investigating, along with his colleague Harry Yorke, into who was funding Labour Together, which is this sort of Labour ginger group that was started by Morgan McSweeney effectively as a way of kind of reclaiming control of the Labour Party from the hard left, and became a vehicle for Starmer and Starmer's leadership campaign. After McSweeney had left, and it was being run in those days by Josh Simons, who is now a minister in the Cabinet Office, they got some leaks. And I think if one is putting a generous interpretation on it, they were concerned by where the leaks had come from and whether or not they'd been hacked by nefarious persons before they made their way to journalists. Journalists obviously can obtain information from all sorts of places, and sometimes things that have been acquired in dubious circumstances find their way through various think tanks and eventually into the hands of the press. And we've seen this before. And I suspect Labour Together was slightly unnerved that a lot of its internal information was finding its way there. And I think they involved GCHQ in that as well. But they paid money to do an investigation, which was not about plugging the leak. Ultimately, it dissolved into a study of Gabriel Pogrund, his religious views, his political views, and clearly an attempt either to smear him or to obtain leverage over him. And it's a really rum state of affairs. I mean, it sort of doesn't make any sense either that they hired a public affairs firm to do this rather than a cybersecurity firm. Simons has now come out and said, "This was not my intention. I did not ask for this to happen. When I discovered that it had, I removed it from the report that we were provided." And, some of the technical stuff was then passed to GCHQ about the leak, but this stuff about Pogrund and Yorke was not. But it's a pretty terrible look. And frankly, if this was a Conservative group doing it, Keir Starmer, Mr. Lawfare, would be straight up saying this was a matter for a police investigation and completely unacceptable. I mean, it is encouraging, I guess, that we've seen various members of the Cabinet come out in the last 24 hours and defend Gabriel Pogrund as an upstanding journalist who makes their life bloody difficult, but who is basically, if I was going to point to three journalists who are protecting British democracy and upholding fair play in public life, I would put Gabriel Pogrund at number one, and I don't know who the other two would be. So, frankly, this is absolutely disgraceful. And, lots of people like to have a pop at the media, but frankly, a free press is one of the few defences that we have against political wrongdoing. And it was very striking, actually. Richard Hermer, the Attorney General, who is obviously one of the kings of the sort of human rights agenda, not a view, not an approach to the world that the Spectator and its readers particularly share, but we made him Peer of the Year in our awards show towards Christmas because we thought he'd been the most significant member of the House of Lords. I think that was fairly undeniable. He was gracious enough to turn up and accept an award from a magazine that hasn't exactly applauded all of his activities in government, and he made a very gracious speech and said, yes, I do care about human rights, but the one I care about as much as any is freedom of the press. And he praised the Spectator for taking a robust view of things and holding people to account. And in the same way, Gabriel Pogrund is an absolute sort of bastion of that. So this is very, very awkward for the government. And there's now, of course, an investigation. Who would you get to investigate something involving a Cabinet Office minister, James? Who, if you were the Prime Minister, would you ask to have a look at that?
Well, I certainly wouldn't get the Cabinet Office to investigate one of the Cabinet Office ministers, particularly also when it involves a Labour Party issue from 2 years ago. So I don't understand what on earth this probe is doing, and I suspect Mr Simon's going to be very grateful that it's actually in recess now and that Parliament isn't there to do all sorts of awkward, urgent questions.
Yeah, quite. I mean, where Parliament's sitting, I can imagine we'd have urgent questions. We'd have the minister dragged to the House. A select committee would announce an inquiry into this matter forthwith. And this would get very, very awkward indeed for the Labour Party. Look, there may have been a cock-up somewhere along the line here, but assuming that this was more malintentioned than Labour Together have led us to believe, it does strike me once again as this case of a bunch of people who come along and think, we're the good guys, and then start behaving like they're not. It's like that Mitchell and Webb sketch where, the chaps are looking at their SS helmets with the death's head skulls and at some point turn to each other and go, hang on a minute, are we the bad guys here? And there does seem to be increasingly regularly a situation where Labour or its ministers or its hangers-on behave in a way that they would regard as absolutely deplorable were it done by anybody else on the political spectrum.
Yes, and Keir Starmer's come out this morning while doing broadcast clips for that aforementioned social media announcement and said he knew nothing of it. And it does sort of, so many things are being done in and around him by people who are in his governmental team. It does seem, I think that's about the 12th different story he said of which he knew nothing.
Well, quite. And you only have to look at Mandelson as well. He knew nothing there. There was one of the nefarious, wicked satirists who does things with AI online last week had Starmer done up as Manuel from Fawlty Towers. I know nothing. I know nothing. And that is not going back to where we started this conversation. Starmer is heavily disliked. You go into any focus group, you can see that people really loathe the man and they don't take his word for it. And so increasingly, if the defence is I know nothing, that is not something liable to persuade the public. And this is, why ultimately the question to whether he is going to hang on is at best a coin flip, really.
Well, I think on that we shall leave it there. And maybe in the spirit of which we started this conversation, we should quote another Fawlty Towers line, don't mention the war. But right now it's a phony war in Westminster with recess. So Keir Starmer will be hoping he keeps that spirit up in the next few weeks. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for listening to Coffee House Shots.